Thank you. I was in UC Berkeley and graduated in 1965 and joined the Peace Corps for what I naively thought would be 2 years, and then I would come back and go to law school. I went to Ethiopia as a teacher, and I was assigned the first volunteer as a teacher in a little western village called Gambela. When I got to Gambela, I had not known anything about the war that had gone on at that point for over 10 years in neighboring Sudan, where the southern Sudanese faced tremendous difficulties from the government in Khartoum. But when I got to this village, I found that there were about 20,000 refugees from South Sudan who lived in the area, and they had no way of going to school. My job as a Peace Corps volunteer was to be a teacher. But Peace Corps encourages all volunteers to engage in additional activities, some kind of community development project of our own choosing. And so I found a source of funding to rent an empty coffee warehouse in the village that enabled about 125 Southern Sudanese refugees to come into the village and go to the government school. There was also sufficient funding to get them t-shirts, shorts, and flip-flops so they'd have something to wear, pencils and notebooks, and 3 meals a day. I administered the hostel as a volunteer, and I lived in the warehouse with them. And I'd hear very frequently terrible stories of atrocities and horrific things that were happening to their families back in South Sudan. Well, I extended for a 3rd year. Peace Corps service is normally 2 years. But I extended for a 3rd year in order to get the Ethiopian teachers in the school interested enough in taking over the administration of the hostel. And they did, because I wasn't sure that the next volunteer teacher Peace Corps sent in would want to do the same thing. In 1969, I finished my Peace Corps service, and I was approached by the Anyanya movement. The Anyanya was the name of the African Liberation Army in South Sudan. Anyanya is a term from Equatoria, where the people there take the head of a cobra that's been dried, and they extract a poison, they dip their arrows and spears into it, and it's kind of a fearsome name. So that's the name that they gave to their movement. So I was approached by the Anyanya, who asked me what I was going to do now that I'd finished Peace Corps service. And I said I wanted to come back to the States and go to law school. But they said, please come in with us instead and become the first foreign witness to what was happening in South Sudan. Because the Sudanese government had sealed off the South. They expelled all the missionaries, they allowed no foreigners in a country half the size of Western Europe, and there were no journalists allowed there. And so nobody knew what was happening. But over 1 million people had already died in that conflict. So they asked me to come in with them for 2 reasons: to try and get publicity for what was happening, and to see if I could find a way to bring in emergency humanitarian assistance. So I ended up spending 10 months with them. I walked about 3,000 miles. They had absolutely no vehicles. Everything was footing, as they called it, by foot. And I ended up making a film for NBC TV and did research for a consortium of World Council of Churches agencies, and we initiated a cross-border emergency humanitarian relief program. In 1971, I spent the longest time. I was there for about 6 months, initiating a journey from where Congo, Uganda, and South Sudan meet to up northwest of there to where the railway comes from Khartoum. The Sudanese army used to send by rail their armed troops down to the south to fight the war. And the Anyanya was going to go up there and attack the railway. And they asked me to go with them and to film them. In April 1971, it was the dry season. The Sudanese army was very mobile. Sometimes we had to walk 12 to 15 hours a day so that the Anyanya would not get caught in a situation unawares, because the Sudanese armies had vehicles, armored cars, tanks, and so it was very, very difficult. One day we were walking in April 1971 south of a village called Rumbek on our way to the railway camp. And there was a civilian who came and approached the Anyanya, and he said, please, can you help me? And they said, what's going on? So we went with him. And we found his brother. He and his brother had been hunting a buffalo. And the buffalo attacked this man. You could see a hole in his forehead where you could see his brain. His eye was gouged out. He was full of body wounds. He was sitting on the ground stoically in a great deal of pain. A buffalo is the most dangerous animal in Africa. It's a very wily creature, and what it often does is to pursue hunters by circling around in the grass and then attacking the people who are trying to hunt them. And that's what happened to this poor man. So the Inyanya asked, can you help him? I'm not a medically trained person. I have no training as a medical person. I carried a very small stock of personal medicines with me, anti-malarial pills, halazone and iodine tablets for all the drinking water. The week before I had a terrible attack of diarrhea and an unknown fever, but I had some tetracycline tablets, so I self-treated with that and it resolved the issue. I had 2 tetracycline tablets left. So I gave them to this man's brother, thinking this would be a psychological palliative, but I really didn't have any hope for him. 20 minutes later, the Inyanya said, we have to continue walking to the railway camp, and we left that spot in the bush. 4 months later, I was in New York. The film was completed. It was shown on First Tuesday, NBC's equivalent of 60 Minutes, and we started an emergency relief program through this World Council of Churches agency group. In February 1972, that 17-year conflict ended with the Addis Ababa peace agreement, and Sudan was at peace. The civil war had ended. Because of the work that I had done with refugees and the unique experience traveling with the Inyanya, I was invited to help resettle refugees and organize the reconstruction of schools and clinics that had been destroyed during the war. That's where I met my wife, Ayo, who came from Harlem Hospital in the emergency room as a nurse. We both worked for the Commission for Relief and Rehabilitation, and she was the director of nurses in South Sudan. In April 1973, the governor of Bahr Ghazal province recognized there was a very serious drought that year, and he feared that there was going to be a famine impending. So he asked me to do a survey of drought conditions in Bahr Ghazal, in the province, and to see how we could bring in food relief in a way to link the distribution of food with development activities, kind of like a food for work program where wells and farm-to-market roads could be built. During the survey, I went through Rumbek, and I saw some of the Inyanya rebels that I had traveled with. So it was a great time. We sat under a tree, drank some beer, and I recognized one of the soldiers had been with that man in the bush. And I asked him, do you remember the villager that you took me to see? He said, yes. I said, how long did he last until he died? He said, that's Mawao. I saw him last week at a dance in Yero. I said, what? How? He had such terrible wounds. The conditions in the bush were awful. How? What happened? And he explained what happened. The Dinka people have a tradition of bone setting. Traditional Dinka bone setters have an enormous capacity of dealing with the most horrific bone injuries. The Dinkas are pastoral people. They have only cattle, nothing else. And yet in their austerity, they have developed this very sophisticated way of dealing with terrible injuries. For example, during the Anglo-Egyptian condominium, if a British colonial official or district commissioner, say, had fallen off a horse and had a compound fracture of his leg, there was no way to medevac him to Khartoum, so they took him to a traditional Dinka bone setter. And that's what they did with Malwal. They took him to a traditional Dinka bone setter. They plucked the bone fragments out of his skull. They took a piece of cow horn, boiled it in some herbal concoction, jammed it in his head, and it wasn't rejected. The skin grew over it, and Malwal 2 years later was dancing. He was not the best looking man at the dance, but he was dancing. And Malwal's story is a good example of the incredible tenacity of the people of South Sudan. That peace agreement lasted for 11 years. Unfortunately, oil was discovered in the South, and by 1983, a second civil war began. That lasted for 23 years. Another 1 million people lost their lives. but then they became independent. And that's another story.